This is SOW Extra. I'm Theodore Ross, Editor-in-Chief of the Food and Environment Reporting Network. Today, I'm speaking to FERN Senior Editor Ted Genoways. His most recent story is How America's Largest Beef Producer Exploits Refugees for Profit, which he co-wrote with Esther Honig and Bryan Chou. The story is about a basically forgotten day in U.S. history, December 12th, 2006. That was when ICE conducted nationwide immigration raids on meatpacking plants owned by Swift and Company. It resulted in nearly 1,300 undocumented workers being taken into custody, the largest single worksite immigration enforcement action in U.S. history, and it dramatically transformed the food system in this country. Ted, welcome back.
Thanks for having me back, Ted. It's good to be here, always.
You're becoming something of an irregular, almost as if you work for FERN.
Yeah,
Shocking.
It feels that way sometimes.
That's good. Your story in High Country News is an interesting one. It takes you back to a familiar destination for those of us who know your work, which is Greeley, Colorado, and the JBS factory there. Why don't you tell us about the story a little bit and what drew you back?
Yeah, so as you say, I've been reporting not just on Greeley and the JBS plant there, but more broadly on JBS as a company, and even more broadly than that on beef and meatpacking in general, and immigrants and refugees. And what I wanted to do was something that would be a bit of an overview that would kind of help stitch all of that reporting together, and anchor it around what I thought of as a kind of watershed event, which was the raid of that plant and 5 other plants like it that were then owned by Swift and Company, and after the raid came to be owned by JBS. That raid occurred in December 2006. So we're approaching the 20-year mark since that event occurred. And my opinion, and the opinion of many people who have looked at this, is that there was a real change in not only the way that people were hired, what kind of workforce those meatpacking companies were looking for, what that did to the demographics of small towns across the middle of the country, and then how that affected politics, the way that people felt a kind of predictable backlash to the sudden influx of people who didn't look like they do, didn't speak the same language, didn't have the same religious background, ethnic background. And so this was an attempt to get enough perspective on things to see what had happened at that moment, but also what the effect has been on the middle of the country and on our politics nationally.
So you and I, Ted, you may know this, or maybe you haven't thought about it. We've been working on stories together since 2015.
Yeah.
And in each of those stories, in one way or another, we've had the same argument, which is about how much history should be included in the story. What is the willingness of the American reading and listening and viewing public
Right.
to take in history along with the other parts of the storytelling? And in this particular story, you have defeated me utterly.
Yes.
It is largely history. But I think in this case, the history that you're telling, those 2006 raids, they're really, really important, not just in terms of what you've described, but for what's happening today. So why don't we ask the first basic question of the interview, which is, why this story now?
Right. So these raids that occurred, what are known as the Swift raids, because they hit those 6 Swift and Company plants simultaneously, December 12th, 2006, they were the first major enforcement action undertaken by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE. And the fairly recently at that point created Department of Homeland Security. And so this becomes a kind of defining moment. It's easy to forget, but Homeland Security and ICE were created in the aftermath of 9/11, and specifically coming out of the 9/11 Commission's report and recommendations, having to do with communication among intelligence agencies, and also then recommending that we have a mechanism that better tracks people who are in the country, so from other countries, so that we have some sense of where they are and how they're communicating with each other. All of this was presented as an anti-terrorism measure. And so the fact that the first time that ICE undertook something that was a significant enforcement, that it was at meatpacking plants and arresting undocumented workers, line workers, it it was a real shift in what the expectation or what the justification for this agency had been, and it really set the mold for that. And so, all of the raids that we're seeing now, and all of the talk that we've heard out of the Trump administration about needing to go after people who are undocumented, and including people who they have recently made undocumented by rescinding their protected statuses of one sort or another. This idea of using ICE essentially as an internal police force that goes and arrests people that the administration has decided they don't want in the country anymore. That goes back to this event during the Bush administration.
Not just this event, I think it's worth saying this single day, this
Right.
one single thing on this one day in 2006. And I think if I can add on to what you're saying, there's sort of two massively relevant things right now that emerge from the story that you're telling. And one, yes, it is this focus on undocumented laborers in this country and also refugee laborers in this country, and the tensions that are created in the United States when many of our systems, but definitely our agriculture and our food systems in a large way are dependent on workers from other countries, whether they're here legally or with a documented status. That's one thing that emerges from there. The creation of that pull, pull that's tearing the country apart today.
Right.
You could trace it back to that one moment. The other thing, if you look at the food system specifically, and you talk about this very directly in the piece, and I'd like you to elaborate on this, is a transition in the food economy, one from what was undocumented labor in a significant way, working in those plants, producing meat for the United States, to one that was based on refugees and immigrants, and how that happened, because that's a big part of the story.
Right. So it's there are several parts to answer that. The first is that because the raid focused on undocumented labor, and ended up arresting in those plants probably about 30% of the people who worked in the plants, about 10% of Swift's workforce overall. It had a major effect on Swift's ability to just keep the line running at these large plants that were the sort of the flagships of their operation.
And let's
And
just reiterate, it's 6 plants in multiple states,
that's
right?
right. Yeah,
Yeah.
across the middle of the country. And so they faced this immediate crisis of needing to find new workers just to try to keep their lines running. And ultimately they didn't make it another 12 months. They ended up selling the company to JBS, a foreign company, a Brazilian owned or Brazilian operated company, because they couldn't meet the production standards that they needed to stay profitable. JBS, so Swift had set the policy that the idea that they would try to recruit refugees because they fit a lot of the same profile as an undocumented worker. They, or they don't have deep roots in the community. They don't have easy access to, you know, uh, all sorts of sort of public representation in terms of like the police force or a city councilman or whatever it may be. Um, and they also don't have like an easy way to complain to the union. To just flash forward for a second, I mean, one of the things that has occurred coming out of this, it's not unusual to get inside of a meatpacking plant today and find that there are dozens of languages spoken, literally 50 languages or more. And you think about what that does in terms of a workforce's ability to unionize and organize. It's so fractured. People can't speak to each other, and very often there are these kind of language barriers that exist even between the workers on a line and who is their supervisor.
Language, culture, and religion too, of course.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so this effort to bring in refugees, part of the idea was they have all the same vulnerabilities of undocumented workers, but they have legal immigration status. And in fact, because the refugee approval process to be formally declared a refugee and to have all of the protections that go with that, because it's so delayed, what you end up with is various forms of asylum seekers, people who are legally in the country but don't yet have the protections of being refugees. And so they are easier to exploit. They are not looking to have any sort of trouble on their record when their case is reviewed. And also, many of them are applying for other forms of asylum, not relying on getting refugee status. One of those things that they will do is apply as full time workers, who are employed in an industry where there are not enough Americans who are willing to do those jobs. Meatpacking fits that description. So there's actually an incentive for the people who are asylum seekers to not only take those jobs in meatpacking, but to not complain, to hang on to them as much as they can, so that when they come up for review, they can say, well, if you're not approving me for asylum, at least you can, can you consider me for this work exemption because I work full time for a meatpacking company?
I think it's also important to point out in the story, you mentioned the potential for abuse of a compliant or under pressure workforce of immigrants and refugees and asylum seekers. The story that you produced is an investigation of that track record of abuse. And I think you should talk a little bit about that. And then we're going to move on to the other questions, but talk a little bit about the things that you're uncovering in this story that just haven't been reported before.
Yeah, so I mean, to some degree, I would say that these pieces have been talked about, one incident at a time, and often covered in local media in Greeley and similar communities. But the whole idea of giving a kind of overview was to establish the pattern you're talking about. And a good example of this is what happened more or less right out of the gate. I mean, in 2007, JBS started hiring a large number of Somali refugees, from the conflict and the sort of failed state there, and they brought hundreds and then eventually thousands of employees, Somali refugees, to be employees at this JBS plant in Greeley. That dramatically changed the demographic of a town like Greeley, especially as these are not only people who are speaking Arabic and who are black, but are also Muslims, and into that still relatively charged, post 9/11 era. I mean, this is a moment of the surge and all of this kind of thing. That there's a lot of xenophobia that surrounds that moment. And so as they were brought in, there were conflicts in the community, but also inside the plant itself. And a lot of that reached a head, around Ramadan, when there were workers who were asking in 2008 to have the schedule that they followed on the night shift, the second shift, to have it just so that the breaks could coincide with the times that they were supposed to pray. And management initially agreed, but then there were workers who complained, including white and Hispanic workers who were Christians, who didn't want their breaks, to be built around Muslim prayer times. And eventually, the group of Somali workers decided, we're just going to take our breaks and pray when we're supposed to. We're going to say that we're going to the bathroom, and we're going to go and we're going to pray. And when that was the strategy that they took, management and sent security and other workers into the bathrooms to grab people and drag them out when they were trying to pray, and declared that this was, an illegal work stoppage because they had left the line at the same time and they were all fired. The workers filed a religious discrimination suit, but at which they eventually settled. But the thing that I guess I would note in this case, and it's so typical of this industry, that suit was filed in 2008. It was eventually settled in 2021.
Yeah, that's the nature of the American legal system. So I want to shift gears a little bit, get into some of the nuts and bolts of the story. I have a feeling I know what the answer to this, but tell me, what is the biggest obstacle to your reporting, or was the biggest obstacle to your reporting on this particular story?
Yeah, I mean, so the obstacle that always exists in reporting on the meatpacking industry is that none of the companies will talk to you directly. That's the first thing, and they certainly will not allow you access to the grounds, to see the place and talk to people who work there. So the way to approach this that we settled upon, was trying to do to get that kind of visibility by looking through 20 years of legal cases that have been brought against JBS, and specifically surrounding this plant. Not only so that we could, get a sense of like what the workflow is and all of that sort of thing, but to see patterns of behavior as you have different HR managers, patterns of behavior as you have different plant managers, that you start to get a picture of what the company culture is, regardless of who specifically is in charge. And as you suggest, like what emerges out of this is a over a period of years, different groups who come into the plant, and within a fairly short period of time, there are class action suits that are then brought against the company for discrimination of one sort or another, racial, religious, um, and those forms of discrimination can be dramatic, like what happened with dragging people out to prevent them from praying. But often they're much subtler, not promoting people, on a religious or racial basis, not allowing them to have jobs that are less strenuous. Um, these sort of small forms of discrimination, but ones that, especially when you're working in highly dangerous and often sort of in jobs that can be crippling, when you are performing repetitive tasks
With knives, very
with
large
knives,
knives.
and where
Yeah.
the injury rate is so high,
Yeah.
not having control over where you work and the pace at which you work and that sort of thing is a significant issue.
Okay. So actually, I'm going to ask you a very quick question, then we'll go to the last question. You talk about the barriers to access in getting into meatpacking plants. Have you actually, in all your years of reporting, how much of any, or if any, time have you spent inside the workplace of a meatpacking plant?
So I've never been on the kill floor. I have been into the like the HR offices, the like the nurses' offices, that kind of a thing, the front offices of plants. Um, but the kill floor is inaccessible. The closest I've ever gotten is, um, getting access to undercover video that's been shot by animal rights groups, or in some cases body cam footage that has, or security footage that has come out of the reporting, but I've never been in there myself.
That's kind of amazing.
Yeah.
All right. So last question. Normally, this is a pretty open-ended question in these conversations. They ask you, what is the takeaway from the story? But I want you to focus on a pretty contemporary takeaway, which is, what are we supposed to make of this history in the current moment when Donald Trump is targeting workers with temporary protection status and refugee status and asylum? One of the things that we looked at in this history is that every time JBS and their other peers in the meatpacking industry were faced with a problem of labor, they went to a equally, if not more, vulnerable population, right? So that's what we're tracking with the shift from undocumented to refugee. One of the things that we've been speculating on a question we can't really answer is how can the meatpacking companies sit by and allow their workforces to be deported, right, or rounded
Right.
up? And what are they going to do next? So you don't have a crystal ball, but what's the takeaway from that phenomenon?
So the first thing I want to say is just that, as you suggest, that because there's been no comprehensive immigration reform for decades now, what has happened instead is that there's been a tendency to expand and reform immigration policy through executive order. What the Trump administration tested was their theory that if you can expand immigration by uh, executive order, that you can also reduce it in that exact same way. And the Supreme Court agreed. Um, it's not something that I find particularly humane, but I think it's legally sound that if you can extend temporary status, you should be able to rescind temporary status. And so by doing that in a widespread, indiscriminate way and doing it without regard for people's circumstances, it has made for a case where Trump is suddenly able to say more than 1 million people are now without legal status, and they're people who are in the system. So we know exactly where to find them.
Yeah.
And we've dramatically increased the size of ICE to be able to go and arrest people and also to be able to detain people. So I fear that what we're about to enter into is an era where there will be perhaps millions of people who are rather rapidly rounded up and detained, and in a system that is not really built to handle that sort of capacity, which is bound to lead to abuses and to you know squalid conditions. That has been certainly the pattern. As you suggest, this is not good news for the meatpacking industry because this has been their workforce for 20 years. I think it's significant that JBS, through their subsidiary Pilgrim's Pride, were the largest donor to Donald Trump's inauguration. When they were questioned about that, they said, "We're an American food company that just loves celebrating, the peaceful change of power." I would just like to note that they are Brazilian owned. So it's a bizarre statement on multiple levels. But clearly, what they were trying to do is exert influence, and the most notable way that that has happened already is that Trump has, because of in the past, because of criminal convictions, because of criminal admissions, they have not been able to trade on the New York Stock Exchange. Trump made that possible for them within weeks of that large inauguration donation. My suspicion would be that they're going to try to raise capital in that way, that they're hoping that if they have to pay domestic workers and pay them a higher rate, that they will have more cash on hand. That's my optimistic hope. My dark concern, if we want to be honest about this, is that if you have millions of people who are in a detention system where the process is extremely slow, I fear that there will be an argument made that those people should be farmed out as prison labor, and that they may end up going back to work in the very plants that they were arrested in, except as free labor instead of as low wage labor.
Well, that is not a pretty picture, but I think we're going to have to leave it at that. Ted, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. It's great being on, Ted. Even when we're talking about tough stuff, I always enjoy the conversation.